Hello, and welcome to Module 3. So this module is going to be concerned with Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. So for the purpose of this video lecture, this is going to be a basic overview of Aristotle and his approach to virtue ethics. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to just talk about some general information, get a sense of who exactly Aristotle is. And we're going to introduce some important terminology. Specifically, we're going to talk about the term teleology, purpose, and proper function as it relates to Aristotle's approach to virtue and virtue ethics. We are going to talk about what is the purpose of life, human life, and what is eudaimonia, what is the good life, and what exactly is virtue and virtue ethics, right? And then the module is going to close out by talking about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach, specifically as a preacher and as a kind of a moral exemplar. So what we're going to do then, the way this is going to be broken up and structured, unlike some of the other modules where I will go into some detail about the reading, in this first video lecture, we're going to just introduce some of the basic terminology. And then once you've watched this video, then I want you to pay attention to a couple other videos where we're going to talk more specifically about the good life and what exactly virtue is and how should we understand virtue ethics according to Aristotle. And then that will be followed by a couple other short videos dealing with Martin Luther King Jr. as a preacher and sort of the moral basis for his radical approach to political activism. All right, so then let's just begin by thinking about who exactly Aristotle is. Well, Aristotle was born in 384 before Common Era and died approximately around 322 in the before Common Era. And it's also important to recognize that Aristotle was a pupil, a student of Plato, right? He was a student at Plato's Academy. But he also went on to found his own academy, which is known by the name the Lyceum. So he's very similar to Plato in that regard, insofar as he puts a lot of importance and emphasis on teaching and education. In fact, he followed in the footsteps of Plato and went on to create his own academy, right? In addition to that, Aristotle is widely recognized as being a tutor or a teacher for Alexander the Great. And if you know anything about Alexander the Great, he was very influential in bringing this sort of the Greek Empire to the rest of the world. And we're not going to get into detail there, but insofar as Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle and spread the sort of culture to many other places in the world at that time, then that can largely be credited to Aristotle, who again was the teacher of Alexander the Great. But since Aristotle was the student of Plato, then I think it's also going to be helpful to think about and compare Aristotle's approach to Plato's approach. They're similar in a lot of ways, but they're also very different in a lot of ways. Think back to the previous modules where I talked about how everybody in the Western tradition has largely been, in one way or another, responding to Plato's Republic. That was sort of the place where everything, kind of began. And now we have someone, a student of Plato, who was directly responding to Plato's views. Right. So I've got this sort of this picture here of on the left you have Plato, and he's pointing up towards the sky. And on the right, we have Aristotle, who is pointing towards the ground. He's sort of concerned with the things around here in this vicinity, in this area. So we might wonder, why was this piece of artwork created in this way? Why is Plato pointing towards the sky while Aristotle is pointing towards the ground? Well, Plato was focused on the forms as a kind of a Platonic heaven, a Platonic realm where the form of goodness exists, the form of justice, the form of education, all the different forms that are supposed to serve as kind of templates, or you might think of them in terms of like the idealization of justice, the idealization of goodness. These things exist not in this world, but in, in a heavenly sphere, in a heavenly realm. And Plato thought that in order to understand what goodness is or what justice is, we have to think about the form of goodness, the form of justice. And recall back to the previous module where we discussed this in some detail, right? So then Plato's pointing upwards towards the heaven because Plato thinks that we need to use the forms as a kind of a guide, as a sort of a blueprint in order to understand the things in this world. So if you want to understand things like what is a cup in this world, well, we need to think about what is the form of being a cup in the Platonic heavens, right? Aristotle took a different approach. Aristotle was not focused on some heavenly sphere or heavenly realm. Rather, Aristotle was concerned with the things of this world, the universals and the particulars that exist in this world, not in some unknown world beyond this world. Indeed, Aristotle was very much a biologist, right? Aristotle wrote extensively about the things that he observed in this world, about different animals and different creatures and critters, as well as humans. All right, so you can think of him then as a kind of a natural philosopher. So going back to my cup, if you want to know what it is to be a cup, you don't look to some heavenly abstract notion of what it is to be a cup. You look at this cup and you think, what is it to be this cup? And then we can compare that cup to another cup and then to another cup and think about what they all share in common. What sort of universals exist amongst being a cup? As well as what's particular about this individual cup, right? So again, Aristotle, unlike Plato, was a natural philosopher. He was concerned about the things and what was taking place in this realm, in this world. And so that's why the painting has Aristotle pointing towards the ground, while Plato is pointing towards the sky. Now, both Plato and Aristotle wrote extensively on a number of different really important issues, but Plato wrote primarily in dialogues. If you wrote in any other way, then we're not really aware of it. We don't have those. They didn't come down to us, right? But we do know of Plato's dialogues. And in the dialogue, Socrates was the main character. He was the person going around from city to city, asking probing questions to the people that lived in the cities. On the other hand, Aristotle wrote very systematic philosophy. He did not write dialogues, at least not that we're aware of. And his systematic philosophy dealt with a number of different issues, and they were all interrelated, right? They weren't just some stories that were told and somehow we have to kind of piece them together. Rather, he wrote in a systematic way, one issue building upon another issue, building upon another, always being tied back together by some central themes. That being said, some of what we have from Aristotle was written directly by him, and some of it was not. Some of what we have from Aristotle was actually written by his students in the form of notes that were being taken during the lectures, somewhat similar to what you have here. In fact, the book that we're concerned with right now, the Nicomachean Ethics, is thought to be largely written by some of his pupils, some of his students. But we still credit it to Aristotle because it's Aristotle's ideas, the lectures that he gave in the Lyceum, and in the community of philosophers and students, which became the dominant sort of philosophical approach after Plato, and has now come down to us as being one of the most important works in ethics in Western civilization. Additionally, Aristotle is credited with offering a new kind of logic, what's known as Aristotelian logic or Aristotelian syllogisms. And if you have a chance to take, an introduction to logic and critical thinking, then you'll probably cover this sort of logic. This is where we get the notion of Aristotle's square, and that was the dominant logic all the way up until only a couple hundred years ago. And so again, this was one of the ways in which Aristotle is thought of as being one of the most important philosophers, perhaps only second to Plato or Socrates. All right, with that in mind, let's turn our attention to Nicomachean Ethics more directly. The first thing I want to call to your mind is the books that Martin Luther King Jr. had in his syllabus. These are books 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these first 5 books of the Nicomachean Ethics deal with the basic object or function in human life. Deals with moral goodness. What does it mean to be a good person? That's book 2. Book 3 and 4 deal with virtue. And then book 5 deals with justice. And so I think that it's really interesting how Dr. King selected these 5 books. Of course, the readings that you have are only excerpts of the books. If this was a longer course, we would actually read all 5 of these books in quite a bit of detail. Unfortunately, just because of the nature of the class, we're not able to do that. So you'll read just some excerpts, but we are going to pay attention to the different elements that are covered in these books, because I do think that it's interesting how Dr. King went through what exactly it means to be a good person, to be a virtuous person, and then to end on the notion of justice. And I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, but the Nicomachean Ethics is kind of a prelude to Aristotle's book on politics titled Politics, right? So in a certain sense, Aristotle thought that being a virtuous person was a key feature, a key aspect of being a political person, right? You have to have the right sort of training and virtue in order to be the right sort of ruler, the right sort of person doing politics, a person who is engaged in the political life of the city. And I'll say a bit more about that here in a minute. But we have this general question of why this book is so influential in Western society. So let's just think about some of those reasons. First, Aristotle is kind of thought of as the philosopher's philosopher. In some ways, Aristotle has been treated as, well, if you want to know how to do philosophy, pay attention to Aristotle. Aristotle gives us a paradigm example of what philosophers do. Likewise, he's thought of as the philosopher's philosopher because he puts all of the focus on reason and rationality, right? Reason and rationality are central in his approach to both the philosophical life and the political life. And I think that that's actually quite important for Dr. King's approach to politics, because as we will see throughout this course, King is continuously putting reason and rationality on the highest pedestal, right? In fact, in a lot of ways, his view of nonviolence, he characterizes this in terms of resistance. He thinks of this in terms of what's the most rational thing to do. This is the reasonable and rational approach to political engagement. This is a kind of a journey developing more and more, closer and closer towards a pure reason, a pure rationality. And so we can see this as a kind of motif or a sort of a model in which he might have been using or working towards. And again, this comes to us from Plato and from Aristotle. This is sort of where all of that began. Indeed, Aristotle defines a human being in terms of a rational animal, right? So if you've got something that is an animal and that animal is rational, then according to Aristotle, you have a human being. That's just what it means to be a human being, right? And in addition to that, human beings that are rational are political animals. That's sort of the goal or the end of being a rational animal, is to engage in political activity. And insofar as Aristotle is defining what it is to be a human being in this sort of biological sense, right? He's thinking of us as animals because we are animals. In that regard, then he's thinking of us in terms of a biological definition. This is a kind of a naturalistic approach to what it means to be a human being. And not only is he thinking of us in terms of biological organisms, but he's thinking of us in terms of having certain functions, a certain sort of proper function or proper purpose within the context that we live. So let's say a little bit more about what that proper function is. According to Aristotle, we need to think of it in terms of the golden mean, a sort of a perfect balance between two extremes. And by using this example of a golden mean, he then introduces the notion of virtue or excellence, you might say, right? And so this is the beginnings of virtue ethics, the sort of the idea that what it is to be a good person is to be a virtuous person. And what it is to be a virtuous person is to find the golden mean, the balance between different extremes. And as I mentioned previously, Aristotle treats this as a kind of precursor to the political life. And indeed, we can think of the book, Nicomachean Ethics, as being a required reading, right? A sort of prerequisite before you do the politics. And so you can see why Martin Luther King Jr. would have included the Nicomachean Ethics in the syllabus right before the politics. In fact, this is the only book that really addresses ethics in any real detail. The rest of the books that we're going to read, while they deal with in some regard what it means to be an ethical or moral person, but they are more specifically addressing political issues. Whereas this book takes on the question of what is the good life, what it is to be a good moral person. It takes those issues on directly. And you might think, I think that it's quite natural to think that the reason why we include this book prior to the politics is because Aristotle treats ethics and living a virtuous life as being something that's a necessary feature of being a political person, being a political animal, right? So he makes this very strong connection between reason and rationality and ethics, or what it is to be a good person, live a good life, live a life of eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Some other reasons why this particular book is so important for Western civilization is because it is still the dominant influence in the Roman Catholic Church. And this is credited to St. Thomas Aquinas, who really was inspired by and used, if not really kind of plagiarized, much of Aristotle's work. In fact, Aquinas actually refers to Aristotle as the philosopher, as if there were no other philosophers to refer to, right? It was just recognized that the philosopher is Aristotle, right? And so oftentimes when Aquinas is putting forth his own views, he then supports his position by basically saying, the philosopher thinks, or the philosopher, Aristotle, taught such and such, right? And insofar as the Roman Catholic Church was hugely influential in sort of shaping Western civilization, and insofar as Aristotle was hugely influential in shaping Aquinas's views, Aquinas being the dominant theologian for the Roman Catholic Church, well, then we can see why Aristotle has come down to us as really kind of shaping and forging the different features that we recognize as being central to Western civilization and our different approaches to ethical questions. Indeed, it's not just the Roman Catholic Church, but this is still one of the most influential ways in which the Christian religion in general has treated issues that are related to what is it to live a good life, what is it to be a political animal, what is it to be a politically engaged, and so forth. Therefore, we can see how Aristotle is highly influential for Dr. King's approach, both as a preacher and as someone who is politically active. All right, then. So what I want to do now is I want to introduce some really important terminology, some sort of key concepts that I think will be very important for you to pay attention to as you go through the next set of video lectures. So we've got this term teleology. What exactly does this mean? Right. So a kind of a dictionary definition. I think I might have taken this from either the Oxford, or it might even be from Wikipedia. But the basic definition is the explanation of phenomena in terms of the purpose that the phenomenon serves, rather than the cause by which the phenomenon arises. This is sometimes associated with design, right? So if you've taken any other like intro to philosophy courses, you might have heard of the teleological argument, which is just another name for the argument from design for the existence of God. But basically what that means is we're thinking about some phenomenon, whatever it might be, in terms of what that phenomenon's purpose is. What is it designed for, rather than what caused that thing? So since it's putting so much emphasis on purpose, let's think about what the human purpose might be. And for Aristotle, as well as the Greeks in general, here we get the term eudaimonia, which is the notion of human flourishing, which can really only be achieved at the end of one's life. It's not something that you can pinpoint at any particular point in your life and say, I have now obtained eudaimonia. Rather, the notion of eudaimonia is really referring to a person's entire life. Did they live a good life? Did they live a full and flourishing sort of life? right? The purpose of the human's life is to flourish, to live well, and not just simply to get by. In addition to the notion of purpose as it relates to teleology, we also have the notion of a function or a proper function. There's a lot of different ways that we might think about function. For example, you may have been introduced to this term in a logic course or maybe in a mathematics course. Here, the idea is just kind of, you can think about it in terms of a vending machine, right? Where you put something in to the function and then the function spits out some output, right? So if you put a dollar bill into the Pepsi machine, you push the button and then it pumps out a Pepsi. So then the function is to deliver the Pepsi from the vending machine, right? That's just kind of a silly toy example of what a function is. But you can see how this works in mathematics. You might also see how it works in logic. But this notion of having a function is widespread, especially throughout the biological world. And this is something that Aristotle really picked up on and wrote about extensively. So consider an example of an acorn. You might think, well, the acorn has a particular function, a proper function. What is that function? Well, it's to grow up into an oak tree, right? That's what an acorn does. If it has good soil, fertile soil, and it's got the right amount of sunlight, the right amount of moisture and nutrients and so forth, then if everything goes well, then it will grow up into an oak tree because that's its function. That's its proper function. Now, of course, there are plenty of situations where it never does grow up into an oak tree. Maybe there's an animal that comes and takes it and eats the acorn, or maybe there was something wrong with the acorn initially, or maybe the soil's not fertile and so it never grows up, or maybe it does start to grow up and it becomes a seedling, but then it gets chopped down for some reason. Lots of different reasons why the acorn may never actually grow up into an oak tree. Nonetheless, if everything goes right, then it will grow up into an oak tree because, according to someone like Aristotle, that's its proper function. That's its aim. That's its goal. That's what it's designed to do. That's its purpose. And so Aristotle observed the natural world around us in very extensive detail insofar as different biological organisms have certain functions. In that regard, then, to speak of something as having a kind of a good or having an end, having a teleos, is simply to refer to that thing's purpose or that thing's proper function. Another way of putting that is to say that it's what something is aiming at. It's something's goal, right? So the good or the end of you taking this class is to achieve a degree or a good job or whatever other reason you might have for taking a class like this. It's what you are aiming at. It's your goal, your purpose, insofar as you're enrolled in this class. So then the next question is, what is a human being's purpose? What is the teleos, the good, the aim, the end of a human being? Well, that is eudaimonia, right? It's living a good life, living well, not just simply living, right? That's our purpose. That's our aim. That's our good or our end, if you will. And of course, for Aristotle, eudaimonia requires both a virtuous life, living well, but it also requires reason and rationality. So you need to have both elements involved in your life and to the highest degree that you can in order to be truly living a flourishing, good life, to really achieve eudaimonia. But if everything goes well, if you've got everything that it takes to achieve this, then you will, because that is a human being's teleos. That is the end or the good for a human being. And for Aristotle, this culminates in civic duties. This culminates in political engagement and political activity, right? So we need to have both a virtue, right? Living virtuously, living a good life. We also need to have reason and rationality. And when these things are combined in the right sort of way, then that's going to culminate in civic responsibilities, civic duties, having an active, engaged participation in the political community. And so that's where I'm going to leave things for this particular video. What I would like you to do next is pay attention to the short videos that follow on Aristotle's notion of virtue and virtue ethics, as well as Dr. King's own approach as a preacher and insofar as we can treat him as a kind of a moral exemplar, someone who, really did live a kind of a virtuous life, insofar as he was both virtuous and used his reason and rationality and was politically involved in the community.